England's oldest inhabited castle carries centuries of Catholic worship and the favour of Protestant kings, but what finally ended the Strickland 750-year stay. Welcome to Sizergh Castle. The land that eventually became Sizergh began life as a Norse settlement. Not a village, just farming ground, woodland and a hunting landscape. There were simple forest huts here, but nobody lived permanently on this land. It was a working landscape, not a home. Around 1170, Gervais d'Encop, a Norman baron with major estates in Lincolnshire, was granted this territory by King Henry II. It was a feudal grant, a reward for loyalty and service, and the d'Encops didn't need to live here to hold it. At this stage, the land stayed exactly as it had always been: timber, grazing, hunting and agricultural work. With the d'Encops based in Lincolnshire, Sizergh was simply a useful estate at the edge of their holdings, valuable for income but never intended as a home. In 1239, Elizabeth d'Encop, who inherited the estate, married Sir William de Strickland. Through that marriage, the whole of Sizergh passed into Strickland ownership, and from this point the family began to shape the land with a sense of settling to live there. They were no longer distant holders of a working estate. They were now rooted here, and their influence grew steadily as the generations passed. By the early 14th century, their standing had risen enough for Sir Walter Strickland to be knighted, which shows how firmly the family were establishing itself within the region and gaining recognition beyond its immediate lands. In 1332 and again in 1361, Sir Walter secured royal permission on 2 separate occasions to enclose Sizergh as a deer park. This was a significant step in the development of the estate. A park was not a home, it was a controlled hunting landscape, a managed stretch of woodland and pasture that demonstrated wealth, authority, and the ability to maintain a private environment for sport and income. Creating a park that showed that the Stricklands were rising in status and shaping their territory with intention, yet it still did not require a fortified stone house. At this stage, Sizergh remained a landscape of management and prestige, rather than a defensive residence. Between 1340 and 1350 saw the Scots raiding the border, and these raids were fast, damaging strikes aimed at livestock, crops, and anything worth taking. They were carried out by small groups who crossed the border quickly, grabbed what they wanted, burnt what they couldn't carry, and retreated before anyone could respond. Sometimes they pushed further into England to avoid retaliation, which meant estates that weren't directly on the border needed defensive buildings too. Because of this pressure, families across northern England began replacing timber halls with fortified stone towers. Sizergh was no different, and the first stone structure was built on the land, a 4-storey peel tower. It was a fortified living quarters with walls thick enough to endure attacks, narrow windows, and a roof platform for archers and defensive assaults. Around the same time, the plague was raging through the north, leaving families without workers to help defend the land, and no soldiers to patrol the Scottish border. The north was at its weakest, so the smartest thing to do was to build a stone tower to defend their land. By the early 1400s, the Stricklands had moved beyond the simple work of defending their estate. Their standing changed decisively in 1415, when Sir Thomas Strickland carried the English banner at the Battle of Agincourt. Bearing the King's standard was an honour reserved for men the Crown trusted completely, and Agincourt became one of the most celebrated victories of the 100 Years' War. Sir Thomas's role drew the Stricklands into the king's military circle, bringing favour, secured land rights, and long-term patronage. This shift strengthened the family's position for generations and set the stage for a rise in the family's name. 100 years after the Peel Tower was built, the worst of the Anglo-Scottish raiding had eased, and this allowed the family to begin building for comfort and prestige. There was only one prominent way to do this, and that was to build a great hall. This is the moment Sizergh stops being a fortified tower and becomes a medieval manor house. The hall allowed the Stricklands to gather for business and hospitality alike, and it became the place where estate administration was carried out. From Sir Walter, who was knighted, to the Scots forcing the construction of the Peel Tower, and Sir Thomas raising the family's standing through the honour of the Agincourt, the presence of the Great Hall reflected the status of the family name. Between 1555 and 1585, Walter Strickland rebuilt Sizergh on a scale that erased its medieval core. He lifted the Great Hall onto the first floor, replaced the old service rooms, and built two long wings that formed the U-shaped plan. The kitchens and the service spaces were enlarged, and a long gallery was set above private lodgings. In these 30 years, the fortified house was stripped back and remade as an Elizabethan home built for comfort and status. In the autumn of 1536, the North rose in defiance against Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries. As the old religious world collapsed, thousands gathered to defend it. They marched beneath the 5 wounds of Christ, demanding the restoration of the monastic houses and the end of Cromwell's reforms. The rising shook the crown and ended in brutal reprisals. Amongst those who joined the movement was Walter Strickland. It's remarkable that the future builder of Elizabethan Sizergh once protested the destruction of monastic England. The Pilgrimage of Grace carried the highest possible cost: execution, the loss of land and title, the confiscation of estates, and the ruin of entire families, and many who took part paid with their lives. Except Walter. He emerged with a royal pardon, an outcome that should have been impossible for a man who had stood inside a rebellion against the crown. The Stricklands survived their Yorkist ties and Walter's role in the Pilgrimage of Grace, emerging with a royal pardon and a secure position under Henry VIII. Mary I's reign briefly protected the Catholic allegiance, giving Walter room to build with comfort and grandeur in mind. When Elizabeth I became queen, that loyalty again put them at risk, yet the family pressed on with the works while presenting outward conformity to the new religious order. By the mid-16th century, fortified houses had lost their purpose. Families invested in luxury, not defence. Sizergh's medieval core no longer matched the Stricklands' ambitions. What followed was an Elizabethan mansion with carved oak interiors, ranked amongst the finest in the north. This is the point that Sizergh becomes recognisable as it is today. After the Pilgrimage of Grace, the Stricklands entered Elizabeth's reign already known as committed Catholics, a reputation that was remembered, watched, and politically risky. Elizabeth I's religious settlement of 1559 banned Catholic practice, and everyone was required to attend Anglican services. Families like the Stricklands were punished with heavy fines whenever they stayed away from church, so Sizergh became a household trying to balance outward obedience with private devotion. They followed a cautious strategy, turning up at church just enough to avoid financial ruin while keeping their real faith alive inside the home. This pressure shaped Sizergh's Elizabethan design. The long gallery, the rooms beneath it, and several discreet or hidden spaces were created for a family living under suspicion. Although they were fined again and again, the Strickland survived through wealth, careful behaviour and political neutrality. Their Elizabethan interiors, carved oak, symbolic decoration and richly panelled rooms were built in a world where elegance carried risk. In this period, Sizergh becomes not only an Elizabethan mansion but a quiet Catholic sanctuary hidden in plain sight. The orchard was planted in the same century, forming part of the estate's food supply. Apples, pears and stone fruits were grown for cider, preserves and winter storage. And although the trees have been replanted over time, the orchard still sits exactly where the Stricklands first laid it out. It's one of the oldest living features of the grounds. The herb garden dates back to the 1600s, when the Stricklands shaped the land around the house for practical use. It supplied the household with medicinal plants, cooking herbs and everyday remedies, and its layout still follows those early patterns. As the Stuart era began, Sizergh stood as a Catholic home inside a nation that had officially turned Protestant, and the Stricklands' situation grew increasingly fragile. Under James I, families who held the old faith were monitored, fined and treated with suspicion, especially in the tense years following the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. Even so, the Stricklands kept their standing by treading carefully between their private beliefs and the loyalty they showed in public. When the Civil War broke out, they supported the king's side, aligning themselves with Charles I. A choice shaped by long-held tradition and the political instincts common amongst Northern Catholic families. The conflict brought danger, heavy costs and constant uncertainty, yet Sizergh itself remained unharmed. Its Elizabethan wings, private rooms and long gallery continued to shelter a household living under watchful eyes and shifting authority. By the time the monarchy was restored in 1660, the Stricklands had endured years of penalties, scrutiny and national turmoil. Despite all of it, their estate survived the entire Stuart century intact, one of the few Catholic houses in the north to come through without seizure or collapse. After a century marked by fines, scrutiny and constant pressure, the Stricklands entered the Jacobite era, facing yet another wave of political uncertainty. When James II was forced from the throne in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, many Northern Catholic families kept their loyalty to him, and the Stricklands were amongst the most steadfast. In 1689, Sir Thomas Strickland left England to join James II and the exiled Stuart court in France, where he served the king directly. Sizergh was managed by relatives and trustees during his absence. Sir Thomas never came home. He died in France in 1694, still devoted to the displaced king. The family slowly returned to Sizergh in the early 1700s, as the Jacobite court declined after James II's death in 1701. By the 1715 Rising, the estate was fully lived in again, though the Stricklands' loyalty to the Stuart cause remained unchanged. They escaped seizure during both the 1715 and 1745 uprisings, through careful political restraint and quiet, steady management of the estate. The castle itself saw almost no alteration during these years. The Elizabethan house stayed solid and unchanged, whilst the family's fortunes shifted with each turn of exile and allegiance. In the 1700s, the gardens shifted from medieval practicality to Georgian elegance. Lawns, shaped borders, and planned walks were introduced to frame the house as a view rather than a fortress. These formal touches softened the stone and created the balanced, open spaces that lead visitors from the house into the wider landscape. By the middle of the 18th century, the Stricklands had weathered yet another era of danger. Their home still stood, their identity remained intact, and their story carried the imprint of a family whose loyalty to a lost king endured across generations. After the turmoil of the Jacobite years, the 18th century finally brought a calmer chapter for Sizergh. With the Stricklands back in England and the estate secure, attention shifted once more to the house itself. Around 1770, the Great Hall was enlarged and given a Georgian makeover, softening the older medieval and Elizabethan character with more fashionable proportions and decorative detail. It wasn't a dramatic transformation like the Tudor rebuild, but a measured improvement, a sign that the family could once again invest in comfort rather than survival. The medieval tower, Tudor wings, and Elizabethan gallery remained unchanged, but Georgian touches added a new elegance and helped guide Sizergh toward the feel of a modern country house. The 19th century was a steady, settled time for Sizergh. With the estate secure, the house began to adjust to Victorian life. The changes were practical: better heating, updated service rooms, and more comfortable living spaces. The medieval tower and Elizabethan wings stayed exactly as they were, but the interiors slowly shifted toward Victorian taste. And through it all, the Stricklands remained here, continuing a family line that had lived at Sizergh since the 1200s. The Victorian period expanded Sizergh's productive gardens. The kitchen garden supplied vegetables, fruit, and cut flowers for the household, managed by estate gardeners who kept the family's table running all year round. It reflects the Victorian drive for order, abundance, and self-sufficiency, and it remains one of the most practical corners of the estate. One of the most striking events of this era was the removal of the famous inlaid chamber panelling, sold to the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. This was authorised by Gerald Strickland, who spent long periods abroad and likely needed to raise funds for the estate's upkeep. Victorian country houses were notoriously expensive to run. In 1999, the inlaid panelling finally returned home and was restored to its original place. In the early 1900s, Thomas Strickland lived at Sizergh, but the financial burden of maintaining the estate grew heavier with each passing decade. In 1915, Thomas transferred Sizergh to the National Trust. Preserving the house had become the most important duty of a dwindling family. Yet the Stricklands did not leave. They retained the right to live in a private wing, keeping their 750-year connection alive, even as Sizergh became a public heritage site. The limestone rock garden was created in the 1920s by Victoria and Henry Strickland. Inspired by the arts and crafts movement, they shaped the natural stone into terraces, pools, and planting pockets, creating one of Sizergh's most distinctive features. That long residence finally came to an end in 2012 when the last Strickland, Henry, passed away. With his death, Sizergh became fully managed by the National Trust, closing the chapter on centuries of continuous family life within its walls.